Oh, hello. Welcome to today's video. So, we're going to be changing tack a little bit today. We're going to be talking about 30k, which is a game we cover sometimes on the channel. And we're going to be reviewing the new 30k Zone Mortalis Rules from the Siege of Cthonia book. So, what is Zone Mortalis? Well, if you've been someone who follows the channel and watches all the videos I put up, you'll know that Mrs. Tail to Impulse and I are playing a Horus Heresy escalation campaign, and we've been in the Zone Mortalis now for quite some time. We've played 4 or 5 games, and there are some problems we have with the rules as they were presented in White Dwarf. The game's quite one-sided, but Zone Mortalis is essentially a way of playing Warhammer the Horus Heresy on a corridor-themed board. If you're a kill teamer, and if you're watching this, chances are you are, it's similar to Into the Dark. But as you can see in that picture, it is a different terrain set. The spaces are a lot wider and a lot more open, which makes sense, right? Because Kill Team is fundamentally a game about individual operatives, so the corridors can be quite tight. Zone Mortalis contains Terminators and squads of up to 15 models, right? So you do need some bigger spaces, but it's a similar kind of idea. And yeah, if you've been following the Fires of Isfahan series on the channel, you know we were using the prototype rules from White Dwarf. These rules are, just to give you a quick summary, a massive improvement in many ways from the prototype rules in White Dwarf, and I'm actually really quite excited for them. So, terrain changes from White Dwarf. So, I've gone right the way through, and I've tried to highlight all the various changes I could find from this compared to the White Dwarf issue. I appreciate I've not made it the easiest to see. I thought these yellow boxes were clever. So they've changed something about doors just very briefly. In the original White Dwarf version, when you were destroying a door, a large door had 6 hull points and a small door had 3 hull points. Now all doors have 3 hull points. They've also added in this system called System Override. So once per movement phase, before any models are moved, the active player may choose to expend 1 reinforcement point. We'll come on to those reinforcement points later, they're a new mechanic. 1 reinforcement point to attempt a system override. To do so, roll a d6, add 1 to the result if any friendly model on the battlefield has a Cortex controller or an Spectre. If the result is 3 or more, all pieces of door terrain are now controlled by the active player, and the active player may immediately change the state of any pieces of door terrain that are not destroyed. A really, really potentially powerful rule that you can just do, in your turn to try and gain control of all the doors if you have spare reinforcement points. So we're going to talk about the force selection and the reinforcement points in a little bit, so please do bear that system override rule in mind. And that goes alongside with the new rule for crushed. The sudden closing of bulkheads and airlock doors poses a threat in itself to those caught unaware, trapping and crushing limbs with their weight, as the door's servos repeatedly cycle until they burn out. Despite the risks, many attempt to haul stricken comrades clear of the mechanisms before they close upon them, often risking injury or death themselves. If any model is on a piece of door terrain when it's changed from the open state to the closed state, or this results in 1 or more models from any unit being no longer positioned in unit coherency, the unit the model is part of suffers an immediate Strength 8 AP- wound, with no armor saves, invulnerable saves, or damage mitigation rolls allowed. The door terrain is then destroyed and removed from the battlefield if possible. So, yeah, straddling doors is a dangerous thing for your unit to be doing, especially now people can bring down the doors as they would like to. They've also, compared to the White Dwarf rules, added in a new terrain piece, so this is debris, or debris, I guess, if you want to pronounce things properly, but that's very boring. So, debris, moving while within debris terrain. If a model starts their movement in debris terrain, their movement characteristic is reduced by a -2 during that movement phase. If they start movement outside an area of debris, but has a high enough movement characteristic to enter an area of debris during the movement phase, then you must declare if you want the unit to try and enter it as part of your move. If you choose not to enter any part of the debris move as normal, but may not enter any area of debris, if you choose to enter the area of debris, you apply the -2 modifier during the phase. The modifiers applied to current movement characteristic before its movement is here to apply as long as the model remains in the area of debris terrain, or until the end of the current movement phase if it leaves the area of debris terrain as part of its move. If the application of this modifier would leave the model unable to reach an area of debris terrain, it's still applied even if the controlling player alters the model's movement characteristic and no longer intends it to move the area of debris terrain. My word, that is a lot of text to say that it's -2 movement and don't be a dick. Right? People say the kill team rules are wordy. Sorry, I missed a bit. When drawing line of sight to a model that is the target of shooting attack, a model that is in or at least 25% obscured by debris has a 6-up cover save. Debris is neither difficult terrain nor dangerous terrain, and its effects are not mitigated by special rules or war gear that interact with those terrain types. And if you charge through a debris terrain, is it going to be you get -2 inches to your charge distance? Hang on. Models are slowed when charging through debris terrain if when charging one or more models have to move through debris terrain in order to reach the enemy by the shortest possible route. The unit that the model is part of applies a modifier of -2 to its charge distance. This modifier is applied in addition to any other modifiers that might apply to its charge distance. If at least one model in the charging unit moved through the debris terrain as part of its charge move, the unit's model... a new bit of the rule. The unit's models must attack at initiative step 1... Ouch. Regardless of other initiative modifiers, even if the charging unit is not slowed by debris terrain. Note that charging models must engage as many enemies in the target unit as possible, even when charging through the debris terrain. So, where this is useful is if you're using the cardboard tiles for Necromunda. A lot of them have printed debris on them, so I guess you could use these rules to represent some of that. That's pretty cool. There are some changes to reactions. So one big criticism that I saw of the rules in White Dwarf was before you could only use the 3 new core reactions for Zone Mortalis: Suppress, Displace and Brace. Those are still there. They're the same. But you can also use any of the advanced reactions in the Warhammer Horus Heresy Age of Darkness rulebook and any army list specific actions. So you've got your specific reactions for your army, for your chapter, which is really cool, nice flavour. You can also use things like Interceptor and Tank. I mean, I don't think off the top of my head any of the advanced reactions from the Age of Darkness core rulebook actually make sense in ZM. Correct me in that if you're a Horus Heresy guy, correct me on that if I'm wrong. But it's really cool that you're able to use your army list specific advanced reaction. That's really great. More flavour, more difference between the legions. You love to see it. So some other core rules changes, sort of, maybe. Objective markers are functionally the same. So I'm not going to read all that. Sometimes you will use terrain as an objective if you really want to. So you can nominate a console or something as an objective. It's kind of an optional rule there. There's this critical objective idea. So at the start of each turn, the player with strategic advantage must roll a d6. The numbered objective marker that corresponds to the result of the roll is the critical objective for the remainder of the turn. The player that controls the objective marker gains an additional 2 reinforcement points at the end of that turn, in addition to the victory points they gain from controlling the objective. I think that rule's just always on all the time. That's kind of cool, but it could just be handing 2 reinforcement points to one player or the other if it nominates an objective that's like the objective that's relatively safe in your deployment zone, right? And then we've got the secondary objectives for Zone Mortalis, which are subtly different. So these are the different secondary objectives, and then the different missions turn them on or off. All right. So you've got Counter-Strike. The player without strategic advantage gains 1 victory point if the first unit of any kind to be completely destroyed during the battle belongs to the player with strategic advantage. Right, so strategic advantage is basically the player that gets to decide if they're going first. If you're not that player, and yet you still manage to kill the first unit completely, you gain a victory point. That's a cool rule. If 2 or more units from opposing forces are destroyed simultaneously, for example, in the same initiative step in an assault phase, no player gains victory points. Champions of Renown, so if this option is turned on for each enemy model with the character unit subtype removed as a casualty, you score a victory point. While fighting a challenge, the controlling player scores a victory point. And Blood Toll, for each unit in the army selected is either a HQ or Elite's Choice removed as a casualty, the opposing player scores a victory point. So I guess it's a good reason to minimise the number of HQ and Elite's units you take for those missions where Blood Toll is turned on, right? Firestorm and Shrapnel, I don't think there's any material changes to Firestorm and Shrapnel, Nowhere to Hide or Blind Panic. I just included them because they have added a nice image, an example there, to show how blasts can go sort of partially through a door, right? So if a line cannot be drawn between any point of the base of the model hit by a blast marker and template in the centre of the blast marker, or base of the model making an template weapon that does not pass through a piece of wall terrain or a door in the closed state, the model is not hit by the attack. So, and it's just an example of how that works, which is cool. But I don't think it's a material change from White Dwarf, to be clear. Deployment and reinforcements at the start of the game. Now, so this is the really new stuff now. So everything I've mentioned so far, little tweaks, largely, right? This is the really new stuff. At the start of the game, players place models onto the battlefield during the deployment phase, and may also choose to place models into reinforcements to be placed on the battlefield later in the battle. Each player has a starting total of reinforcement points, which they must expend to place models on the battlefield during deployment. According to the mission special rules that are being used, players accumulate additional reinforcement points during the battle, allowing them to place models from reinforcements onto the battlefield. A given unit will cost an amount of reinforcement points to place onto the battlefield during deployment, based on which force organisation slot it has been chosen as, and may cost an additional amount to place onto the battlefield from reinforcements on either the flank edge or the opposing player's edge using the counter-assault rule. This allows players to deploy in flanking positions to capture or contest objectives and encircle the enemy's army. Careful consideration of how these reinforcement points are used and where and when units can be brought into play prevents a unique tactical challenge in Zone Mortalis games. Alright? And the games are generally longer, just to put that in there. So in the White Dwarf, the game typically ended on turn 4 and you could roll to see if you got a turn 5. This one rolls turn 4. On a 2-up, you play turn 5. On a 4-up, you play turn 6. The old rule was 4 turns, and then on a 4-up, you play turn 5. And there was no turn 6. So the games are longer, which is also great. I think the barrage weapons rule there is unchanged. This is fine. So let's have a proper look at army selection, which really, for whatever reason, I always get the most excited about army selection rules. And so if you're anything like me, you will be this will be the section of the video that you've been waiting to see. So the first thing to say is the recommended points range is now 1,500 to 2,500 points. And all the games take place on a 4x4 table. In the White Dwarf, there were rules for playing from 500 to 3,000 points, and there was a scaling sort of size of table you could play, starting at 2x2 and going all the way up to 4x8, I think. And there was a 4x6 version and a 4x4 version. So now you're always on 4x4, and but there's a slightly narrower limit of rules that you can play. Now, I'm quite happy with that because if you've been following the Fires of Isfahan, we had played 500 points, 750 points, 1,000 points, 1,250 points, and we were just about to play when we kind of fizzled out because we had a baby. We were just about to play 1,500 points, and that's kind of where we left off. And then we had a baby, and then they also announced this book was coming, so we kind of paused the campaign to wait for these new rules, and now we can go straight in with the Fires of Isfahan campaign at 1,500 points and continue to play in Zone Mortalis, which is really exciting. Now, it's quite clear about its mission sequence that you need to select your army before you know anything about the terrain or the strategic advantage or the mission or whatever it is that you are doing, right? But then it also says, well, maybe you should determine ceilings before you pick your armies, right? So it says down here, due to the effect that designating battlefields having ceilings has on many units, players may wish to decide if their battle will take place on a battlefield with or without a ceiling prior to the selection of the army in order that all the battles are enjoyable. I think if you're not playing with a ceiling, you're playing it wrong. It's not really Zone Mortalis. I think Zone Mortalis games should be played with a ceiling. So the Force Organization slot has changed. On the face of it, it's more permissive, but we're going to get onto these reinforcement points in a minute. So you've got an extra troop slot, two extra elite slots, and one extra heavy support slots over and above what you were given in the White Dwarf version of the rules. You can't have any optional detachments like allies or Lords of War. You have to be playing at least 2,000 points to take your Primarch. Yes. Good. So, army selection. So there are some really important changes to army selection. They've changed the wounds limit for Dreadnoughts to 7. So you can take a Leviathan. One of the big changes that they made in the White Dwarf version that everybody hailed as being wise and sane was, let's not let people take Leviathans. They tend to dominate the game. Well, they decided, actually, you know what, if people want to take a Leviathan, let's not stop them. I suppose it's more balanced in some ways because a Leviathan is a heavy support choice, and as we're about to see, taking heavy support choices is a little bit limiting in some ways, but you have the option of taking a Leviathan if that's what you want to do. But you are limited to taking one Dreadnought per 1,000 points, and also, they're very clear, each Dreadnought takes up a specific slot. Right, so even though Dreadnought Talon would normally mean you could put 3 Dreadnoughts in one slot, you cannot do that. That rule is no longer in play for Zone Mortalis. Okay. Now I'm going to jump around a little bit now and deviate slightly from the order of the book because I wanted to kind of make sense of this new army reinforcement points thing. So let's read through this carefully and consider what it means. So after beginning deployment, each player must calculate how many reinforcement points they have as a starting total. Unless otherwise noted, this will be 6 per player. It is 6 per player on all the missions, more or less. Some mission rules mean each player has more or less than this. In these instances, the amount of reinforcement points each player has as a starting total will be indicated in the mission rules. At the end of each turn, each player will gain a number of reinforcement points, unless otherwise noted, it is 2 per player, but certain mission rules may affect the amount. For example, for controlling or denying objectives or destroying enemy units, and in these instances, the amount of reinforcement points each player gains at the end of each turn will be indicated in the mission rules. You may find it useful to keep track of how many reinforcement points you have by keeping a tally or using tokens or spare dice. Depending on the Force Organization's chart slot, a given unit is selected as alters how many reinforcement points it costs to place in the deployment zone during deployment, or placed on the battlefield from reinforcements. Some missions may present an alternative chart of costs, but for Zone Mortalis missions that do not, the following chart should be used. So your Primarch costs 8 reinforcement points, so you can never start with him on the board, except you can. We'll get to that in a minute. Your HQ slot costs 4, Elites 2, Troops 1, Fast Attack 2, and Heavy Support 3, which is quite punishing. Right, so then you deploy armies. The player that does not have strategic advantage must place a single unit from their army in the deployment zone, subtracting the amount of reinforcement points that unit costs from their starting total, according to the values on the chart on the previous page. The player with strategic advantage must then place a single unit from their army in their deployment zone, subtracting the amount of reinforcement. This is such a wordy book. Subtracting the amount of reinforcement points that unit costs from those starting total according to the values in the chart on the previous page. Did you need to repeat the whole clause twice, guys? If a model with the independent character special rule joins a unit, the reinforcement costs of both the model with the independent character special rule and the unit if they've joined must be subtracted from the starting total. Models that are attached to it before deployment, such as those with Apothecary Detachment or Techmarine Covenant special rules, may be deployed alongside the unit they're attached to without expending additional reinforcement points. So Techmarines and Apothecaries, you've got more elite slots now, and they don't cost you any extra reinforcement points because they're attached at the start of the game. So they're a really good thing. But if you have a character in a unit, you have to pay for the cost for the character and for the unit, right? Players then continue to take turns deploying a single unit from their army in their deployment zones until either player decides they no longer wish to deploy a unit when it's their turn to do so, or has insufficient reinforcement points to do so. When this occurs, the opposing player may place one more unit from their army in their deployment zone, provided they have sufficient deployment reinforcement points to do so. So that's a really interesting nuance. If you run out of points, right, and yet your opponent is spamming troops, they only get one more unit than you at the start. So you can kind of take control, right? If you if you're running loads of heavy support or elites and you want to wind down the number of points, your opponent's not going to massively outmatch you at the start, but they are going to get cheaper. They are going to get cheap things to come on later in the game. Now, I think it's not clear to me. I think if you have unspent reinforcement points, I don't think you lose those. Yeah, 6 per player. And then you add to them, but there's nothing saying that you don't get to carry those forward. So if your opponent has expensive stuff, they only do few drops, and you're left and forced to keep reinforcement points, I believe you can then spend those straight away anyway, so it's not a big deal. Now, Warlords and Retinues. When placing a unit that has been selected using any variation of the Retinue special rule on the battlefield during deployment or from reinforcements, the controlling player subtracts only the amount of reinforcement points required to place the model that is the leader of the retinue onto the battlefield from their total. So command squads are amazing in this format because you don't pay the points for them. So if you have, like in my list I run Eidolon. If Eidolon is in an assault squad, I've got to pay, a point for the assault squad. If Eidolon is in a command squad, the command squad's free. So command squads, if they were already really good and now they're really, really good. And additionally, the reinforcement points cost to deploy an army's warlord is halved if the controlling player chooses to place them on the battlefield during deployment. Note this only applies during deployment before the start of the battle, not if the warlord moves on from reinforcements after the start of the battle. So this is how you can start with the Primarch. If you're playing a 2,000 points plus game and you've taken your Primarch, you can drop your Primarch, in his retinue of 10 like elite terminators of his legion, if that's what you want to do, and that's only a 4 reinforcement point drop. So you could have your Primarch Death Star going down for 4 reinforcement points, right? And then you've still got 2 reinforcement points left to drop down a couple of troops units on backline objectives. That sounds quite good if you want to play the ultimate kind. And it's silly, but also it's fun, and the fluff supports it, because a lot of these Zone Mortalis missions absolutely are, well, I'm a Primarch, so I'm going to get my, 10 of my best men, and I'm going to board the enemy ship on a boarding torpedo myself and race to the command center to find my brother Primarch and have a big old Barney on the bridge. That's it's dumb because it's no longer a tactical game, but it is absolutely an accurate representation of what happens in the Horus Heresy. So, I think Primarchs are going to be good. Now, the interesting thing about this is, if we just flip back, Warlords, when choosing, nominate one model to be a Warlord following the guidelines. So the Primarch can absolutely be a Warlord, that's not a problem, but you do have to take a HQ other than your Primarch. So you've got to have enough points for your Primarch. Your Primarch, his retinue probably is something you want, and then you're going to want Troops Choice and a HQ. Now, you can't deploy all that, so whatever HQ you pick, that HQ is probably chilling in your reinforcements pile for ages. So it's not an optimal way to play the game because, you know, you deploy your Primarch for 4 points. You've got to deploy him on the board, otherwise you need to find 8 points for him. You deploy your Death Star unit, whatever you're doing, for 4 points. You got 2 points left. You've got at least a troops and a HQ on the board, and you're not getting that HQ down for cheap. So it's an interesting one. You could save the 2 points and then get 2 points in the first mission turn, and then, yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting. Let's keep reading. But I'll be interested in your thoughts down below. We're going to start this at 1,500 points. When we get to 2,000, I mean, I need to paint Fulgrim, and I need to pick those Lord of War boxes on the Hobby Bingo card, and it might be funny. Infiltrate. If either player wishes to place a unit with the Infiltrate special rule on the battlefield during deployment, they must expend the appropriate number of reinforcement points it costs to do so during deployment. The unit with the Infiltrate special rule is then set aside, only placed on the battlefield following the normal rules for Infiltrate, after all other units friendly and enemy that have been placed on the battlefield during deployment. Okay. First strike. So the player with strategic advantage may choose to take the first turn, unless the opposing player can attempt a first strike. So you roll. Is this going to seize the initiative, isn't it? After they've deployed before, the player no. So you can expend any number of your starting total of your reinforcement points not spent on placing units in your deployment zone during deployment and roll a d6. In the results shown on the d6 plus the amount of reinforcement points declared is 7 or more, the first strike is successful and you can go first. Note that a d6 roll of a 1 is always a failed first strike attempt. So if you want to save up your spare reinforcement points to try and get the first turn, I can't see that being a popular option. But maybe that's just me and my lack of tactical nuance. I think bodies on the table is always going to be better. Like, I could see spending reinforcement points to do the doors thing, like later in the game, because you've got all your guys down, there's no one left off board, and you're still generating these reinforcement points. So you're like, yeah, I'll spaff them into trying to turn the doors on and off or whatever. But I can't see turn 1, I can't see doing it unless, I mean, it's a big board as well. It's not like you often get an alpha strike on Zone Mortalis, right? Because turn 1 is, well, I move up, and then I move up, and we start like cagily opening doors. It only really kicks off turn 2 and turn 3, generally. Don't know. And then we play the mission, and we're going to read some more of this stuff as well. So, reinforcements. Starting with the second player turn, at the start of their subsequent player turns, the active player may choose to place any of their units that are held in reinforcements onto the battlefield, provided they have enough reinforcement points to do so. The player first selects the unit they wish to deploy from the units in reinforcements, and then selects the battlefield edge they'll move on from, subtracting the amount of reinforcement points to move on from the selected battlefield edge, as they're detailed in the rule. We'll get to that in a minute. Right. If an independent character joins another unit, the reinforcement points cost to both the independent character and the unit they must have. Yes. Why is this so wordy? Yes, the same rules apply. Good. Until they've expended their current total reinforcement points or no longer has any use in reinforcements or the battle ends. Yes. Good. Any unit that's placed in reinforcements and has not been placed on the battlefield by the end of the battle does not count as destroyed for the purposes of victory points, primary and secondary objectives, right? Which is good. So we're just going to shoot over the bottom to the designer's notes, larger armies. When fighting battles using armies of around 2,000 points or more, the Zone Mortalis rules and missions presented here, specifically the reinforcement points cost and reinforcements rules, may mean that even over the course of an extended battle, it may not be possible to place every unit on the battlefield. This is deliberate. And is intended to cause players to make tactical choices during the course of a dynamic battle, where considered deployment of specific units at the right time can have a significant impact on the outcome. So in theory, you could keep upping the points limit. You could effectively, if you wanted to, you could play Zone Mortalis with like a 10,000 point army list, if that's what you and your opponent agreed to. The reinforcement points limit, it becomes effectively like a roster in Kill Team, right? Like a sideboard, because you're choosing what armies to pull in from your army list. And depending on how you structure your army list, you may not be able to ever get the reinforcement points to get them all in. So that is an interesting thought, right? So we got another section here on, there's a lot of rules for reinforcements. We got another section here on moving on from reinforcements. When a unit is placed on the battlefield from reinforcements, the controlling player places the unit within a distance equal to the model's movement characteristic from any access point on the controlling player's battlefield edge if they've been positioned just off the battlefield. The controlling player may choose to increase the movement characteristic of a model by choosing to run, but the unit cannot charge or use any abilities or special rules that must be used at the start of the turn. In the turn, it arrives from reinforcements. If the reactive player chooses to declare a reaction in response to the movement of a unit entered play from reinforcements, they may only use the interceptor advanced reaction. So we did mention that you could use the interceptor advanced reaction, so that is an option now in the game again, which is good. Although with it being a corridor board, hopefully there's not that many opportunities for interceptor. It's not like playing on an open board where you can have some dudes with a last cannon on a hill going, lol, we intercept, you die. So hopefully it's not that punishing. If for some reason the model's maximum movement characteristic is insufficient to fit the entire model onto the battlefield, place the model as far onto the battlefield as you can. If this leaves the model in a position where it may fall off the battlefield, then mark the position the model is meant to be occupying in some manner, and then position it more safely. Yeah, make it work, says the designer. He used a lot of words to say make it work, right? Some Zone Mortalis missions allow players to place units on the battlefield from reinforcements as a counter-assault. So when moved onto the battlefield from reinforcements, the controlling player may choose to expend reinforcement points in addition to those expended to deploy the unit itself in order to place the units on the battlefield using the counter-assault rule. So instead of moving on from an access point on the controlling player's battlefield edge, they may instead be moved onto the battlefield edge for an access point on either of the flank edges, or in some cases, an access point on the opposing player's battlefield edge. So if you pay the points, and we'll come on to this in a minute, if you pay the points, you can actually come in behind your opponent if you have the points to do that, right? The counter-assault table for each mission varies, right? So the counter-assault table will indicate the reinforcement point costs and will show unavailable for positions that can't be used by that player. And then we talk about Deep Strike. So a unit with the Deep Strike special rule reduces the amount of additional reinforcement points it costs to be placed on the battlefield from reinforcements as part of counter-assault by -1 to a minimum of 0, but the base number of reinforcement points it costs to place the unit on the battlefield in any situation based on the force organization chart slot the unit was selected in is unaffected by the special rule. So what this means in effect is, generally speaking, it's 1 extra reinforcement point to come on from the flank. So if you have a Terminator squad in reserve, for example, it can come on from the flanks for no extra cost. Okay? Decide Victor. Once all turns have been completed in a battle played by using Zone Mortalis missions, the victory is decided by the number of victory points, primary objective, blah blah. At the end of the game, if you're tabled, you lose. Right? Good. Yes. We're going to talk about Zone Mortalis terrain. Okay, so we've jumped around a bit because I wanted to explain all of the things to do with the reinforcement points together, and the book didn't do that. So that's why we've gone to the place terrain step, which obviously comes before the play the game step. So we're going to talk about terrain now. So all Zone Mortalis missions intended to play on a battlefield measuring 4x4. But if you've gone outside the 1,500 or 2,500 point armies, you can go down to 2.2 or up to 6x4. But it's really not supported by the rules, right? So when you place terrain, you must decide what terrain will be available for the battle. The Citadel Zone Mortalis floor set is the perfect basis for Zone Mortalis battlefields, and it allows players to place individual 12x12 fixed configuration tiles to cover the battlefield. If such tiles are used, players treat each as terrain pieces and fit them together to form the desired battlefield surface. And then you can find it useful to use additional separate door terrain, barricades terrain, and debris terrain alongside the fixed tiles, which I think I'd really like to make Plastic Zone Mortalis. I have an entire set to make enough. I have enough Necromunda floor tiles, like the blank ones with no walls on, to make a 4x4 table. I bought them ages ago, right? They were expensive, but I bought them ages ago. I have up there on the shelf Dark Uprising, which includes 2 sets of the walls and columns. I worked out that to make a full 4x4 table, I would need another, I think it was 13 boxes of walls and columns, and that's to make a traditional, a plastic equivalent of the one they used to sell in resin. That's not to mess around with anything with stairs and ladders and multiple levels. So that's something I aspire to do. I think it would be a really cool thing to have. I don't know where I'd store it in my house, and I know that there are much cheaper MDF and other things that I could do. And if I want to play this tomorrow, I've got the Necromunda cardboard tiles and the freestanding plastic doors from Necromunda. Like, I can play it without doing that, but there's a real big part of me that's always wanted it's even cooler than Into the Dark, like a really cool all full plastic Zone Mortalis table, but it would be quite expensive. So let's look at what you'd need to play this game. So you'll need your 12 by 12 tiles, enough to make a 4x4 table, right? So that's 16 tiles, either the cardboard ones with the pre-printed designs on, or you could make them on paper with the pre-printed designs on that you just draw on yourself, or you can build them out of plastic for a lot of money and they look a lot better. But you need 12 tiles. And then in addition to that, right, you're going to want, now, or you can go down the route of having separate walls and place the separate walls. And the thing goes backwards and forwards on whether you want to do with walls or whether it wants to do with the tiles. I think it plays better with the tiles, right, by the looks of it. So you've got the tiles. And then for each tile, right, for each 12 by 12 grid sector, but it means tile, okay. So you need a piece of door terrain. So you'll need You'll need 16 doors, half of which are standard size and half of which are large size, and have them in a pile, right? And then you'll also need 16... you'll need 30... twice that. Up to 2 barricades per sector, right? Now, a barricade, it says here, barricades terrain may vary in size, shipping containers, industrial machinery, and makeshift barriers. So they're getting as far as prescriptive as they ever get. They're talking about a barricade being anything from a Minotaurium container, well, I've got loads of those. The little Necromunda makeshift barriers, I've got loads of those. You could also use the kill team barriers, right, if you wanted to. And by industrial machinery, I assume they're referring to the crane and the gravimetric servo hauler. Because remember, 2 of your Zone Mortalis, if you're making like the standard Zone Mortalis grid they used to sell, 2 of the squares on your 4x4 will be completely blank. So you will have space for things like cranes. Like, I appreciate people are coming here from Kill Team and being like, it's very tight, isn't it? No, you're going to have wide open spaces for containers and stuff as well, right? And then the new thing, you can have up to 2 pieces of, this is for the whole board, up to 2 pieces of debris terrain, areas of rubble, pools of noxious broken ground, no larger than 6x6 per battlefield. I don't know what they want you to use here for this. I assumed this was a rule for if you were using the cardboard terrain tiles that they did. Some of those had a flip side with debris on, but you could model up 2 little things of noxious pools if you wanted to use those. Or you could just not use debris. It says up to 2, so you don't actually need to engage with the debris rules if you don't want to. And then terrain placing is interesting. So once terrain has been gathered in accordance with the guidelines given previously, the players roll off. The player that wins the roll-off chooses a piece of wall terrain, or if you're playing with fixed tiles, a whole-ass tile, right, and places it on the battlefield. The opposing player does it the same way, and you alternate until they've all been placed on the battlefield. Then you replace it. Repeat the process to replace all the doors, and then the 2 pieces of debris terrain, and then you can place barricades. Now, with barricades, you don't need to place it says up to 2 per sector. You don't need to place all 24 barricades. When one player says we're full on barricades, they stop, and then you can place 1 more, right? And that's how you build up the map, and it sounds really flipping cool. Okay, to me, I don't know. And then, once all the pieces of terrain have been placed onto the map, each player, starting with the player that placed the first piece of terrain, may choose any one piece of terrain and redeploy or remove that piece of terrain, following the rules listed above. Both players may not select and redeploy the same piece of terrain, right? So you can just pick something up and move it somewhere else, and then they can pick something up and move something else just once, and that's pretty cool. Yeah, I think that's a cool little flourish. And then you're going to designate the terrain. You're going to have to talk about what it is. Right, so you're going to determine ceilings. So when designating the ceilings, a feature of Zone Mortalis mission, the players must decide if the entire battlefield or none of it has a ceiling. If it has a ceiling, wall and door terrain in the closed position are treated as impassable. The height of the wall terrain is treated as to exceed the height of the tallest model on the battlefield. If it has a ceiling, you may not activate any war gear or rules, such as Legion Warhawk jump packs, that allows you to set your movement characteristic to any value and or move over intervening models or terrain. So this is new, right? So under the White Dwarf rules, you could still use the additional movement on a jump pack, right? But this is saying now if you've got a ceiling, you can't use your jump pack to set your movement characteristic, right? Yeah. I don't. So that's that. You could never use the jump over intervening models terrain, but now you can't use it to set your characteristic, which is sad for me because I'm taking a lot of jump pack guys. I'm going to take them anyway because they're cool. If it doesn't have a ceiling, wall and door terrain is not impassable, and players can draw a line of sight over wall terrain or door terrain in the closed state as detailed on page 155 in the Warhammer Age of Darkness rulebook. I think it should have a ceiling. I liked being able to activate my jump packs. I mean, you could just house rule it, right? But I think being able to jump over the walls is silly. But I mean, being able to kind of turbo blast down a corridor is kind of fun. But that was my thing. They've decided to change it, so you have to make a choice one way or the other. Is what it is. Is what it is. Access points. Any point where a model can be placed in contact with the battlefield is considered to be an access point. So this is great. Used to be you defined access points, one each per side. So now anywhere that looks like it should be an access point is an access point. If there are no spaces on any battlefield edge that models can be placed in contact with the battlefield edge because you've got wall running all the way along the outside of your Zone Mortalis, players must designate at least one access point on each battlefield edge and mark it with an appropriate counter. Right, so you only have to designate and mark it with counters if there are no spaces. Otherwise, all the spaces are just spaces, okay, which is great. And then ladders, stairways, and hatches, you talk about those. I don't think you should use ladders, stairways, and hatches. I mean, if you want to make a really cool multi-level thing because you have even more money than I'm proposing to spend on a board, then you go for it. But that's starting to get ridiculous, right? We're not playing Necromunda, right? Determine strategic advantage, so you roll off and then you place the objectives. Now, placing the objectives contain details of how many you need to place. Unless instructed otherwise, you roll off to see you place the first objective marker. Can't be within 6 on battlefield edge, 12 of another marker. Can't be placed on impassable terrain. These restrictions aside, you can place objective markers anywhere on the battlefield. If there are a lot of objective markers or a lot of terrain, you may sometimes find the last few are impossible to place. Where this occurs, simply nudge the other objective markers by the smallest distance to allow the best ones to be, the last ones to be placed, right? Just play the flipping game, just do the thing, just make it work. Don't be a numpty. And that's it. Now we're on to the missions. So the missions fill in the final sort of picture. So there are 3 missions. We got Sector Control. This is the Billy basic mission, right? So long edge versus long edge. Before any models are deployed, a single objective marker is placed in the centre of the battlefield. Starting with the player without strategic advantage, each player takes turns placing a single objective marker anywhere on the battlefield, no closer than 12 to another objective marker and no closer than 6 to a battlefield edge. Once there are a total of 6 objective markers on the battlefield, once placed, players assign them a unique number 1 to 6. So this is your classic 6 objectives. One is in the dead centre, the others are where you put them, right? You use the Counter-Strike mission, the Champion of Renown mission, and the Blood Toll mission, right? You get 1 VP for each objective you control. They're kept even if that objective is lost later in the battle and contribute to your VP totals at the end of the game. So you get 1 victory point at the end of each game turn for controlling each objective. The player with the most VP at the end of the battle is the winner. If you have the same number, they end in a draw. Yes. You have attacker and defender, but it doesn't really make a difference. For this mission, you get 6. Any reinforcement points not used to place units in a player's deployment zone during deployment are retained. You gain 2 at the end of each game turn, in addition to any gained through special rules. You must deploy units from your army up to the amount of reinforcement points you start with using the deployment map that follows. Yes, good. And then, yeah, critical objective, system overriding counter assault. So you can do critical objectives. So you designate one of the objectives at random to be worth some extra reinforcement points. System override. What is that? Is that? Bear with me. Right, I had not realised that. Where is it? System override in the terrain was a rule that can be turned on and off, but there it is. That's what that rule is. Okay, so that's turned on and off in theory by the missions, but it is on in this mission, as is critical objective, as is counter assault, and that is what we would say is the bog standard counter assault table. So it costs an extra reinforcement point for flanking and an extra 3 for the opposing player's edge, bearing in mind that your deep strike units reduce that by 1. Sweep and clear is table quarters. Okay, and it's basically the same stuff, except this time you score 1 victory point for each battlefield quarter you control. A quarter is controlled if a player has more scoring units within it than the opposing player. If a scoring unit has models in 2 or more battlefield quarters, you must select which quarter you're within for the purpose of controlling it, right? And that's it. And other than that, everything else is more or less the same, except now flanking costs you 2 instead of 1, because I guess flanking is suddenly really powerful when you're playing on table quarters, right? Yes. Good. I don't think there's any other changes on there. Fantastic. And then the final mission is Strategium Assault. So this is the asymmetric one. So there's an asymmetric one. The attackers win if at the end of the battle they have at least 1 unit within the defender's deployment zone and the defender has no units in the defender's deployment zone. The defenders win if at the end of the battle they have at least 1 unit within the defender's deployment zone and the attacker has no units in the defender's deployment zone. Right? So as the attacker, you've got to both wipe out the defender and get your models into their deployment zone. You don't need to wipe them out if they obligingly move stuff out of their deployment zone. As the defender, all you have to do is sit in your tiny deployment zone and don't die. It'd be interesting. Right? Asymmetric missions are always weird in my head. They're like, well, how's this going to be? How's this going to go? Now, you've got Counter-Strike, you've got Champion of Renown, you've got Blood Toil. The attacker starts with 6 reinforcement points of units in their deployment zone. The defender starts with 8 reinforcement points to place units in their deployment zone. So I think the defender's got a fair old advantage at first here. Both players gain 2 reinforcement points every turn. The attacker is going first unless their opponent successfully rolls for first strike. Okay. The player with strategic advantage selects who's the attacker and who's the defender. Lockdown protocol. At the start of the first turn, before any models are moved, the defender may select 3 pieces of door terrain to be locked. That's pretty cool. And then from deploying from reinforcements, if you're the attacker, you can get your flankers in for 1 and you can use the opposing player's edge for 2. If you're the defender, you have to pay 2 for the flank and you cannot bring things in from the opposing player's edge. Now, looking at this, I think this is a bit of a bet bonus for the defender, but it needs to be played. It needs to be played to see how it goes. They are kind of boxed in. They will be very vulnerable to certain type of weapons, but remember this is a Zone Mortalis, so it's not really going to be won by shooting, right? And that's it. So this is the list that I vaguely planned for games of Zone Mortalis. So those of you that have been following the Fires of Isfahan series will remember this list. It is tweaked slightly. So we got Lord Commander Eidolon, right, and the Legion of the Gilded Dawn, and they've all got jump packs. I don't care. I just like jump packs. And an Assault Squad with more jump packs, right? And then we got a Tartaros Terminator Squad, a Tactical Squad, and a Phoenix Terminator Squad, and a Contemptor Dreadnought. I did have Cacophonia, the Cacophonia painted. I cannot justify in my heart of hearts taking a heavy support. Cacophonia aren't even that good, right? They never did very well for me in their games. And having to spend 3 reinforcement points to bring them on is just kind of a massive pain in the backside. Whereas this way, like, because I've taken Pride of the Legion and I'm taking 2 squads of Terminators as troops as well, like, apart from the Dreadnought, everything on here has line. So I've got 5 line units, right, which is great, yeah? And as long as I put Idle on his command squad on at the start, that's only costing me 2 reinforcement points, right? So I can put Idle on his command squad on at the start for 2 points. With the Contemptor, right, for 2 points, that's 4. 2 points left, I stick on the Tactical Marines and the Assault Squad, okay? And then I've got the 2 Terminator Squads in reserve, and I can bring them both on the flanks, on separate flanks if I want to, at the start of turn 2. Because I get 2 points at the start of turn 2, and I can put each one on for 1 point because they're troops, despite being Terminators, because of Pride of the Legion, and they have deep strike, right? So they don't have to pay extra to come on the flanks. I think that's the best list that I can kind of come up with at this points value with these limitations, right? So I've not massively changed. Like, I'll have to speak to Helen and ask her what she wants to do with the jump packs, because I could say, oh, well, let's not play with ceilings then. Like, if we don't play with ceilings, jump packs are silly, because you can fly over all the walls and generally just have a ridiculous time. But now, if you're playing with ceilings, then you can't use the jump packs to just go really quickly in a straight line down the corridors, which makes them a total waste of points. So I'll ask if we want to house rule the happy medium that came from White Dwarf. Otherwise, I'll just play and have jump packs that don't do anything. I don't really care. You'd still get, in fairness, they're not totally pointless, because you'd still get, or would you still get impact hits? We'll have to proper think about that. Yeah, so this is 2 squads to paint up. Legion Command Squad, already have those converted, actually. I posted them on Discord ages ago, right? As well as the 5 Phoenix Terminators, which I already have as well. That's it, final. I've been talking for like almost an hour about Horus Heresy while it's 10th edition's hype fortnight. Like, I don't care about the algorithm. If you're still here, just like, thank you, and amazing. So, final thoughts. This is a vast improvement on the White Dwarf rules, and I cannot wait to try them out. Now, it's worth saying, I also can't wait to try out 10th edition 40k, and Ashes of Faith, the Ashes of Faith narrative campaign, and I basically seem psychologically incapable of playing with unpainted miniatures these days. So that's, like, those of you that are following the hobby stream and following on the Discord, I am currently painting the Inquisition team from Ashes of Faith. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 miniatures painted. I have the 2 servitors half painted, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 miniatures that are not yet painted. Hopefully I will get those done, but I'm away this weekend, so that's going to knock out a whole load of potential hobby times there. I'll be back Sunday lunchtime. After those are painted, I'm going to paint 5 Seraphim. That'll get the 40k Combat Patrol finished, and then I'll probably start working on these 2 squads for the Horus Heresy, right? And then I'll be waiting on Mrs. Tabletop Impulse to actually paint any of the... Because for all these projects, she's got to paint her Combat Patrol, she's got to paint up her Horus Heresy list, and she's got to paint up her Chaos Cultists. So the next gaming thing that's going to feature on the channel is, in fact, the Ashes of Faith campaign, because that's what she's painting up now, and she's taking Chaos Cultists to the Warhammer World event in August. I have to tell you, she decided to take them before the internet decided they were the new filth. Zimbad's not going to believe that. Most of you in the comments probably aren't going to believe that, but my wife is just the worst accidental power gamer in the world. Like, I'm going to do this because it's cool, and then the internet goes, that's broken as shit. Let me know if you have any questions about the Zone Mortalis stuff that I glossed over. If anyone actually... I'm kind of guessing the main people watching this are just going to be my super fans at this point after 54 minutes of rambling. But if you're actually here and a fan of Horus Heresy, I desperately want to hear from you in the comments, because at the moment this channel is kind of evenly split between the three Games Workshop make that can have Space Marines in my mind. Like 40k, Kill Team, and Horus Heresy are all things that I want to cover on the channel. Kill Team, out of those 3 games, Kill Team's the only one that I'm very confident about talking about, like how to actually play well. But for the games like Horus Heresy, you'll have to be sustained by my kind of unbridled enthusiasm, right? So please do speak up if you're a big Horus Heresy fan, and do join the Discord. The Horus Heresy room's really quiet, right? Nobody cares anymore. So come in, let's go. Do like and subscribe and comment and all those things, and then I will see you on Sunday evening for a Kill Team themed video of some description that I haven't totally committed to deciding on what that's going to be. But it will be there, and it will be Kill Team themed, and then we will see where we go next week. All right? Have a great evening. Bye-bye. Bye-bye-bye. I'm going to turn this off before I get to an hour of video, because that's absolutely ridiculous. Bye now.